So welcome to today's program, Local Law 97, Unpacking the Proposed Rules. I'm Ellen Honigstock, the Senior Director of Education for Urban Green Council. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. We invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both when you're viewing the presentations and asking questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to our CEO, John Mandyke.
Great, thanks, Ellen, and welcome to all of you. We're thrilled that you joined us today. This is a historic event for Urban Green. As you can see, we're well over 500 people, more than 1,000 registered. This is the largest event in our history, and it's validation to the really important interest on the future of Local Law 97. Today's program reflects 2 years of really good and hard work by the Department of Buildings staff that you're going to hear from soon, from the Volunteer Advisory Board, and from all the working groups that Urban Green has been supporting and participating in to lead us to the proposed regulations that you're going to see today. I think you'll find these proposed regulations are 3 things. First, they're practical and how we make Local Law 97 successful from an implementation standpoint. They're very comprehensive. They get into the nitty-gritty details that we really need to implement the law. And I think you'll see the third thing is that it has a very long-term outlook, which is so important as we plan to our endpoint of 2050 for this particular regulation, and we can put the actions in place to help us get there. So I look forward to the program. I look forward to engaging with all of you. And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Halfnight, who's going to moderate today's session. Chris is the Senior Director for Research and Policy at Urban Green. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and excited to introduce a fantastic panel from city government who's joined us today. We're honored to have them here with us, and I want to thank each of them in advance for their participation. I'm going to introduce them really briefly in the order you see on the screen here. Actually, no, not quite, but in the order that they're going to appear to us during the overview presentation. So first we have Gina Bokra, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at the New York City Department of Buildings in the Sustainability Unit. We also have Ross McWhinney, who is Senior Advisor, the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Then we have Ian Graham, who is Deputy Director of Building Emissions at the New York City Department of Buildings. And also Laura Popa, who is Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability at the New York City Department of Buildings. So with that, I'm going to ask Gina to turn on her camera and to kick us off with the DOB presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, John and Ellen, everybody at Urban Green Council, and to everyone that is joining us today. We're really looking forward to your questions, and we're really excited to be here. We're super excited to have this proposed rule published. And we appreciate the support and feedback that we've received so far. We're grateful to be able to walk through the major topics in the rule with you and to explain some of the background on how we got here. First, I want to discuss what the process for rulemaking is and what a rule does. The Citywide Administrative Procedure Act sets the process that agencies follow, CAPA. And this rule has been in development for well over a year, as John mentioned. It was published in the City Record on October 11th. We have a hearing on November 14th at 11 a.m. You can go to the city's website on rules, and you can either submit questions or comments in writing on that website, or you can sign up and provide testimony at the hearing. And then the department will consider all of those comments. And if there aren't any substantive changes to the rule that come out of the comments, it will be published a second time in the city record after the hearing, and then it becomes effective 30 days after that second notice. So that's the process that we are going through. And I also want to just take a moment to recognize the function of a rule is to clarify the law. The rule is filling in details that aren't included in the law, like setting standards, filing procedures or fees. And there's a lot missing from this rule. So we're not finished. This rule focuses mainly on the items that were mandated in Local Law 97 to be finalized by the end of this year. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about the work that is ahead of us later in this presentation. And now we're going to dive in and we're going to do our best to summarize what's in this rule. And I appreciate that John has said this is very comprehensive, it's very detailed, it's very technical. We started to clarify how to do certain calculations in this rule, providing guidance on what types of energy usage has to be included in your annual emissions, how to calculate gross floor area, which differs from approaches that you take, say, for zoning or egress. And we've clarified how to calculate a property's greenhouse gas emissions limit. We've included details on how to calculate emissions for multiple buildings and campuses. And this is a question that we have gotten often in the last year or two. In short, we've clarified that owners may group buildings into a single report for a property, but only when those buildings share energy services. So if a building can be separately metered from other buildings or it doesn't share energy sources with other buildings, then that particular building needs to report it as a standalone building. And what we're doing here is we're recognizing not every owner has every building isolated or metered, and we need to move to that, but we're allowing this campus approach for now. The rule also includes details on compliance requirements for buildings that are undergoing different types of transitions. It clarifies that newly constructed buildings will begin reporting following the year that they get their first temporary certificate of occupancy. So when they have a full year of data, that's when they get started. We're addressing what happens with a change of ownership. So our initial focus here is clarifying that a new owner won't be responsible for reporting data that was not under their control from an old occupant. And we've clarified that the reporting obligation ends for a building that has a demolition permit at the point that they can no longer provide safe occupancy in the building. And we've addressed property type changes, which is something that we want to get into in a little bit more detail. So maybe two of the most important topics in this rule impact the emissions limits. Those include a transition to Energy Star Portfolio Manager property types, and it includes establishing limits out to 2050. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Ross McWhinney at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice to kick off that conversation.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, Urban Green, for inviting me here today. So yeah, I'm going to describe a bit about how the greenhouse gas intensity limits were established in Local Law 97. I'm going to talk about the data that we relied on, how we charted our path to 80 by 50, the categorization systems that we considered, and then a bit about the interim targets in 24 and 30. Let's see here. So I can figure out how to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so Local Law 97's original limits were set using the 2017 benchmarking data. So this is data that comes from building owners reported to the city under Local Law 84. The city has been collecting building energy data since 2011, but the 2017 benchmarking data was the first to include buildings between 25,000 and 50,000 square feet. This brought, nearly 10,000 additional buildings into the fold, gave us a better understanding of how they consume energy and emit greenhouse gases. And so, the benchmarking data set is a really large and we would say very strong data set. It has a pretty reliable level of data quality for a number of reasons. One, building owners have been reporting under Local Law 84 for many, many years. So they understand the process and their consultants do as well. We've also worked with National Grid and Con Edison to develop automatic data uploads, taking some of the transcription errors out of the picture. The Department of Buildings has made data quality a part of their compliance checks, further improving the reliability. And then, a big part of it as well is that we've established a full-time help center, largely to support this new segment of mid-sized buildings in 2017, but to help all buildings that are subject to local ID4 in their reporting. So this data set is building level data. It tells us how each building that's covered by 84 consumes energy and emits greenhouse gases. And this is largely the same population that's covered by local law 97. So we took this data and combined it with the trends that we observed in the greenhouse gas inventory that the city's been performing for about 15 years now, and used it to plot a path from our base year in 2005 to an 80% reduction in 2050. And so that's what the orange dashed line here represents. You'll see the 2024 and 2030 aggregate limits here on this plot as well. So these are basically where we expect the covered buildings under local law 97 to be in aggregate. But of course, to allocate those to individual buildings, we needed to consider the way different buildings behave. And so we considered two categorization systems to then allocate these aggregate limits to the specific limits that you see in the law. And those categorization systems really came down to the Department of Buildings occupancy group, which was based on the building code's occupancy and use types, and the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager property type. And you'll see these in the columns of the table here. So the city maintains records of building occupancy type for each building. And this is viewed in the process of developing Local Law 97 as a simpler system to enforce because of the existence of those records. However, it's true that the building code designed these categories based around fire risk and safety, not around the way they consume energy. By comparison, the EPA property type categories were designed around largely around how buildings consume energy. And as Ian, my colleague at DOB, will describe in a few slides, Local Law 97 asked DOB and the mayor's office to consider how the law could be implemented using the EPA property type. Another difference between these two systems is that the occupancy groups, the DOB occupancy group, rolls up into 10 categories, whereas the EPA portfolio manager property type is 60 or more property types. So it's a more granular view of how buildings consume energy. So we, in Local Law 97, went forward with DOB occupancy group. That's, of course, the categories that you see here. And these are the limits in the original law in 2024. And before I hand to Ian, I just want to say a little more about the 2024 limit. It may not be widely kind of understood, but this limit is really, as you can see here, not on the trajectory to 80 by 50. It's more relaxed. It was intended to be a warm-up period. I believe that it was set at the 80th percentile of emissions, which means that the large majority of buildings will have to do not much or maybe no work to comply with the law. It really captures the highest emitters in the city's large building segment. And its intention was to get people focused, get them prepared for 2030, and to bring those highest emitters into focus. And then the 2030 limits in the law are established at roughly a 40% reduction by 2030. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ian, who's going to talk about the limits based on the ESPM portfolio manager property type.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Urban Green. And thank you all for showing up to give us an opportunity to sort of walk you through the thinking behind what's in the rule and some of the technical details that are here. So number one, as Ross pointed out, the original law talks about 10 limit values, which were assigned to Department of Building or building code occupancy groups. The law also included, and it's yellow highlighted in underlined text, the fact that there should be a methodology for converting Energy Star portfolio manager property types to equivalent uses. So, number one, let's talk a little bit about the USE Energy Star portfolio managers property types and where they come from. So, the slides work here. There we go. All right. So, for those who are not familiar, Energy Star is a rating system. It's out there. It's been out there for quite some time. The link at the top of the screen, or so just below the titles of the slide, is how to get to the property types and the definitions for those. Simply stated, you go to the website. Sorry, wrong way. You select the property type category. So retail, and you'll find that retail breaks down to more discrete types of retail. You select, say, retail store. It will give you a definition of the types of properties that this group is expecting this assignment to represent. So, understanding the property types, definitions for property types, and understanding the 10 limits of the law, the 10 limit values that are in the law, right? The equivalency was established in terms of finding how Energy Star portfolio manager property types assigned based on energy performance, right? Primary criteria around the analysis was done to do this conversion and to set the limits or assign the limits was to achieve the same aggregate environmental benefit as was anticipated using the building code mapping as when we got done with the property type assignments, okay? Another organizing thought was that the percentile compliance for each of the property types would be consistent, right? So we've gone from 10 groups to 60 property types, and to achieve a consistent amount of compliance for each of those property types, and then assign those limits accordingly. Ultimately, that means that some of the limits went up and some of the limits may have gone down, okay? Because the emissions limits may vary between the building code assignments and the property type assignments, there is an effect on emissions limits for properties. Because remember, many properties are not just one type of property type. It could be seen as many as 5 in some of the reporting. Some folks have selected just one. There can be more. Consequently, since the emissions limits for individual property types may vary from where they mapped under building code, emissions limits may change. Consequently, compliance may change, and therefore penalty amounts may change. In aggregate, we found that 71% of the properties saw no change in limits, okay? And again, this is all about 2024 to 2029 limits, right? Based on historic local law 84 benchmarking reporting, all right? So 71% remained unchanged. For about 6%, we saw property type property limits increase, and for others, 23%, we saw the limits decrease. How does that in fact affect compliance? Remember, limits may have gone down for properties that were non-compliant and remain non-compliant, even though their limits went down a little bit, or they changed. So as a consequence, really almost 98% saw no change in their compliance status. About 0.6% saw their compliance status go from non-compliant to compliant, and a little under 2% went from compliant to non-compliant. So there is an impact. We invite everybody to review, do the math, figure out where your buildings stand individually. Okay. So as Gina had mentioned earlier, the limits in the rule go out to 2050. We'll talk a little bit about how that process worked. Number one, right now, the limits out to 2050 are based on achieving a carbon neutral by 2050, okay? And that decision is based on New York City's commitment to carbon neutrality, the state and the CLC commitment towards carbon neutrality, and really the science from the industry and the world basically pointing to the idea that an 80% reduction is likely not sufficient to get where we need to go and to look more towards a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future. So what does that do to Ross's line? So you'll see that the dashed gray line is the previous trajectory that's there. The orange line basically moves us from the aggregate limit value for 2024 to 2029. And that first blue dot at 2030 is the trajectory that gets us on the path towards carbon neutrality by 2050. Okay, if we extend that blue line out to the 2005 number, you'll see that they align. Okay. So for 2030 to 2034, that first point on that blue line towards that trajectory towards carbon neutrality. Again, getting to 2050, carbon neutral at 2050. Moving forward, again, now we were moving forward not with building code, but under our portfolio management property types, updating coefficients for electricity and steam based on conversations we've had through the advisory board and working group process, and many stakeholders having input in terms of where that's going and looking at what's going on in terms of CLCPA targets for clean electric grid, and actually conversations with Con Ed for clean steam, right? So the coefficients were updated along the way as well to establish these new limits, right? Ultimately, again, maintaining that a consistent compliance profile across the property types, and setting limits, understanding, updating coefficients to maintain the initial stringency anticipated in the law of about 27% compliance in aggregate, okay? And again, getting on that path to carbon neutral. The net result was that the limits that are published in the law, in the rule, overall achieve a compliance rate of around 24%, which is very similar to what's there. So that first stopping point really is fairly consistent with what the law anticipated initially in terms of stringency. Okay. You'll notice in the rule that we have, again, towards getting carbon neutral by 2050, there are limit values for each of the property types on 5-year intervals. And those limit values also consider, again, in 2030, a 50% improvement in the coefficient for electricity from the 2024 coefficient, and about a 96%, a 4% improvement, right? 96% of the 2024 coefficient for steam. And both of, they also reflect, as we move from 2035 and beyond, that path to a clean grid by 2040, right? And clean steam by 2050. All right, so it's a high-level overview. I will turn it back over to Gina to guide us through the next section of the presentation.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Ross, for covering those really big changes in those two topics. I want to, I think I may have to go backwards one slide, sorry. There are some additional items in the rule that we want to point out. We've introduced detail that expands upon the coefficients beyond what Ian just described in the law for different energy sources. So there are a number of fuels that were not addressed in the law that we know are used across the city. So the rule includes coefficients for those sources. It was also important to notice that there are energy sources that we anticipate becoming available in the future that we don't have good data on those now. So there's a process for if you start to use a resource that's not in the law or the rule, you can come to the department, work with us, we'll establish a coefficient together until, a time where the market has more uptake and consistency for those types of fuel sources. Something like hydrogen might be an example. We also established a method for developing a coefficient for electricity based on time of use. So This is really exciting for owners that are, operating their building in a way that, optimizes with the grid. The rule provides right now a set of calculations and resources of information because there's currently no published value that reflects the amount of carbon in the electricity grid at a given hour. So we're going to continue to work with others and see if we can simplify that process in the future. But for now, we have a methodology established. We've also addressed how to develop a coefficient for electricity or for other energy sources that are generated on site in a campus style energy system. So that guidance explains how to calculate various sources like cogen or steam generated on a campus. And that guidance, basically you have to account for all the energy consumption used to generate and deliver that campus energy source. And it includes guidance on how to account for a mix of energy sources like on-site generated energy in addition to utility delivered energy, and then how to incorporate the time of use methodology into that calculation if an owner chooses to do that. And finally, we've started to address distributed energy resources. We haven't finished. There will be more information coming. But for most owners, that means using a time of use methodology for their reporting. That covers distributed energy resources that under the law are not considered to be clean distributed energy resources. And we'll cover that next. So talking about those a little bit further, another item that we do start to address in this rule is renewable energy credits or RECs. But we've only clarified at this point that they are applicable only to electricity emissions. So in other words, you cannot apply RECs to fossil fuel emissions in your reporting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that topic. But back to clean DER, for on-site solar or on-site electricity storage, these are specifically called out in the law. How those deductions will work has been described in this rule. And yes, if an owner has either of these clean DER systems on site, either on-site solar or on-site electricity storage, they can apply a zero coefficient. And that means that they can get double credit for that energy. And that's for now. So that's the approach that we're taking for 2024 to 2029. And beyond that, the approach may change or it might not. So we need to see what happens in the market to be able to say what's going to happen with clean DER in 2030. So, gotten through most of the content in the rule, and it's all very easy now, right? No, it's not. Even as a vehicle to clarify the law, the rule is very technical and it cannot stand alone. So we do want to talk a little bit about our outreach efforts and other resources that we're going to be generating. So we have multiple communication channels delivering this information from Department of Buildings. We'll issue a service notice later this year to further memorialize this sort of operational change on our website. Once the rule becomes effective, we'll have a bulletin or a filing guide with more details about how you put this into practice with examples. We'll be publishing our report on the methodology that we used to transition to Energy Star Portfolio Manager property types, and that'll be on our website soon. We should mention that we're really grateful because all of that work was peer reviewed by the EPA and Department of Energy. So we're really grateful for their help on that. We'll have information in our newsletter and on our websites. We'll be doing more webinars like this one with other partners, like Urban Green, with Building Energy Exchange in a few weeks. With other organizations, we'll be doing a very detailed webinar on the Energy Star Portfolio Manager transition at Department of Buildings soon. We've also engaged the accelerator and HPD to help us get information out on this transition to Energy Star portfolio manager property types. And as of the beginning of October, we have done targeted outreach to 700 owners that were impacted by that change. So we've reached out to them through emails, we've reached out to them with phone calls, and through the accelerator's help, about 60 of them as of last week have started working with the accelerator to start working on improving their building. But as I mentioned, there is more to come. This rule is the start, it's not the finish. And I want to turn it over to our Deputy Commissioner, Laura Popa, to share what is next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Gina, Ian, and Ross, and thank you to Urban Green for allowing us to talk about the rule today. So this was a big leap forward for Local Law 97 implementation, but there are still several outstanding items that DOB will research going forward. The law requires DOB to assess whether the goals of the law can be achieved through different building performance metrics. So we will be studying the possible use of an additional and overlaid efficiency metric and what that would mean for emission targets over time. We are also going to assess methods that take density into account to reflect energy efficient building use. And Local Law 97 requires DOB to assess whether additional allowances or limitations on renewable energy credits are in order. So as we discussed, the proposed rule includes the clarification that RECs can only be applied to electricity emissions, but we really need to study the issue further to understand the RECs market, its trajectory, and the potential impact on compliance and Local Law 97 goals. So DOB will be working with our government partners on this issue. What everyone's been waiting for is we're working on a rule related to penalty determination. Local Law 97 provides for several mitigating factors to take into consideration when making penalty determinations, and we're in the process of defining the scope of these factors, and that includes what constitutes good faith efforts. DOB also needs to draft a rule defining emissions offsets for the 2024 to 2029 compliance period. And we are working on Article 321 implementation, which is the alternative compliance pathway for affordable housing. We've developed an FAQ sheet with HPD, which hopefully helps answer some affordable housing questions in the context of 97. And we are wrapping up our Local Law 97 advisory board process. And we're producing a report which is required by the end of this year. I want to just say the advisory board and the working groups were incredible. They made invaluable contributions to the development of this rule, which we've been talking about today, and have informed further rules and studies going forward. So on behalf of the team, a heartfelt thanks to all participants. And this marks the end of our formal presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, Gina, Ross, and Ian for that comprehensive overview of these rules or these proposed rules. Really, really helpful to get that context, to get the details. We are going to turn to audience questions in just a second. I want to remind our audience that the focus of the Q&A is the proposed rules themselves. We're here to unpack those as much as we can. So please try to keep your questions focused on the proposed rules and the details therein. I also want to remind everyone you can submit questions via the Q&A, and you can also upvote them in the Q&A function by clicking on the little thumbs up next to that question, and questions that get consensus upvotes will rise to the top. But before we get to audience questions, I want to take the liberty of one moderator question. Gina, you touched on the process that has informed these rules. They reflect an enormous amount of stakeholder input. You were at the helm of the advisory board and working group process. Can you share a little bit more with our audience about that process? Who was involved? What kind of input the department received? What was the timeline, et cetera?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, it was quite an effort that, as Laura said, we gained incredible amount of input and valuable insight into the rulemaking process from the working groups and the advisory board. The advisory board is 16 members that were appointed by the mayor's office and city council. And those advisory board members actually helped us to identify all of the experts that have served on the working groups. There were 7 working groups convened and well over 100 individuals that were called on to participate in the working groups. They came from architecture and engineering community. They include building owners. They include environmental justice representatives. It includes nonprofits and healthcare representatives. So a very wide gamut of folks involved in the building industry. And that effort actually started at the end of 2019 with the convening of the advisory board. And then a few months after that, we started to convene the working group. So some of them participated in meetings for months. There were well over 300 meetings in total, including, our friends from the mayor's office, as well as other city agencies and state representatives from NYSERDA, representatives from the utilities. And a lot of the information that we discussed in those meetings has fed directly into the rulemaking that we have proposed.
Excellent, thanks, Gina, and congratulations on that extensive and engaging process, and that really helped get us to today. We did take questions in advance from many of the audience members, so I'm going to get to the live Q&A in just a minute. But before we do, I wanted to tee up a few questions that came in beforehand. We got a number focused on this idea of a time of use electricity carbon coefficient. So again, we heard a little bit about that in the presentation. That's a coefficient for the carbon of electricity that varies depending on the time of day a building uses power. Many noted that the proposed rules include fairly extensive detail and formulas on setting that number using fuel prices. I think some were confused as to why the department didn't just use the actual carbon number. So Ian, maybe you in particular could explain that to us and sort of help translate what's happening with all that detail in those equations to set that number.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I would love to have had the simple answer of saying, use this number, but that number doesn't really exist yet. It would be great if it when it does exist, or if it does exist, that we would point to. In fact, the rule language talks about the fact, in the absence of that number being available, the formulas and the calculations were included. There's a lot there in terms of how to follow how that's set. The simple answer is, based upon lots of conversations with a lot of folks that have deep knowledge in these areas, that essentially the price, the spot price of electricity, the day ahead pricing, is really primarily based on the fuel costs at a given moment in time. Okay, there are certain values that are built into that as well. That's why we have, allowances for the carbon costs from RGGI, and we look at, variable operating and maintenance costs, things like that to back that out. But basically, the math works out such that we're inferring an implied heat rate, which is then used to determine what the marginal emissions is at a given moment in time, based upon spot prices for natural gas and essentially fuel oil. It will be lovely if agencies out there can produce these numbers for everybody to use. But we wanted to make sure that there was a time of use methodology to encourage people to make decisions or include in their decision-making process the idea of choosing when to use power and when not to use power. And to give them the tools necessary to be able to make those decisions, at least in an algorithm that they could apply with some basic data to sort of for them to use for compliance as well. So decision-making on a compliance basis based on sources of information that are out there and publicly available.
Great, thanks, Ian. And I think I'll just add one note to say, you know, the data does exist in some sense, that the New York ISO, the entity that operates the electricity system, has the data somewhere, but there are a lot of sensitivities to putting out numbers that could allow entities that bid into the energy pricing to kind of back calculate and game the system a bit. So I think the overall policy trend in many jurisdictions is towards getting live real-time carbon numbers, but it's probably going to take us a little bit of time to get there. Another question, we got several questions on this topic in the advanced questions, is about the 2030 electricity carbon coefficient. So in the presentation, we heard that number is dropping by about 50% compared to the electricity coefficient for the first compliance period, 2024 through 2029. That is an enormous change. Many were asking why it's so much lower, what's behind that, and what does it mean for building compliance? Ross, could you shed a little light on that for our audience? What's feeding into that number?
Sure, yeah, I'll do my best. So I'd say that a basic point to start is that the state has made big commitments around cleaning the electricity supply statewide. So there's a 70%, the commitment is for a 70% renewable grid by 2030, and then a zero emissions grid by 2040. Of course, those are statewide commitments, and New York City faces some transmission constraints or significant transmission constraints. So we anticipate it'll be harder to decarbonize the grid here than in other parts of the state. So we took those kind of commitments as kind of a baseline of information. The city itself has done some modeling around potential for decarbonizing the grid. We worked with NYSERDA, with several others who have considered this question, and also considered kind of the action that the state's taking around offshore wind and transmission projects towards coming to the city, the Champlain to Hudson Power Express, the Clean Path, several offshore wind projects. Kind of consider all of the action and commitments that have been in place, and spoke with the state themselves, and came to this 50% reduction essentially from what was in place for 2024. And I think I'd want to point out that, we believe that's conservative, but the 2024 number itself is a value that was set prior to the closure of Indian Point. So we don't anticipate that building owners are going to be penalized by the closure of those nuclear facilities through the 24 through 29 period, and then that the signal in 2030 will be a cleaner grid. But we still think a conservative kind of approach to that cleaning pace.
Great, thanks very much, Ross. I think that's a really good news story in the Local Law 97 context here. I'm going to tee up one more question from our advanced questions here around the later year limits, the path from 2035 to 50 and the carbon neutrality idea. We heard about that a little bit in the presentation, that there are new emissions limits through to 2050 and a new commitment to carbon neutrality. And the slides showed a chart with a straight line from 2035 to zero emissions in 2050. That is also a major development. We got several questions on it, and there are actually a few popping up in the live Q&A as well as to what exactly this means. And I'm hoping one of you, and Ross, you may be the one, but maybe one or more of you can share some insight on what this shift means from the 80 by 50 framework to carbon neutrality. What does it mean kind of big picture, and what does it mean in practice for buildings?
Sure, I'll take a crack, and if any others want to add, jump in. But so, I mean, I think at the basic level, and Ian said this in his presentation, we need to accelerate emissions reduction. We know this from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So that's kind of where this is starting. But there's also been kind of clear commitments from the city around carbon neutrality, from the state and the CLCPA around an 85% reduction in emissions. So there's the science, there are policy kind of guidance and requirements that we're responding to. And I think another key is that, this targeting zero, we're considering it as carbon neutrality. So there are already some, I would call them flexibility mechanisms in Local Law 97, the use of RECs, use of offsets. And it's, going to be many years until we even approach this carbon neutral position. But those flexibility mechanisms will probably need to be part of that. And there may be other tools that come up. I think this law is going to be something that we're developing around for a while now. So if anyone else wants to add, please go ahead.
I'll jump in. Thank you, Ross. I think it's important, the point that Ross made. This is a carbon neutral target, not a target for zero emissions for every building. We all know that not every building can totally decarbonize. But what we don't know is 28 years from now, which buildings can't and which ones can. But we are charting out a pathway for those that can eliminate fossil fuels. We need them to, because we have a very unclear picture at this point of where we're going to need to reserve those fossil fuels for highest and best use when we get to that decade. So there's more work to be done. But this is really directional guidance. We need to get as close to zero as we can. And we know that that's not an 80% reduction anymore. So we'll continue working on that.
Great, thank you both. And this is a very big shift that's happening around the world. And the United States is maybe lagging a little bit in terms of adjusting the frame towards the Paris targets and thinking through that carbon neutral 2050 endpoint. But it's great to see the city and the department moving in that direction. So let's turn to the live Q&A now. We've got lots of questions coming in. A reminder again, you can upvote questions as audience members to make them rise to the top. I'm going to take the very top question here, the most upvoted question, which is focused on floor area calculations. There's some detail on that in the proposed rules. The specific question is, we see reference to a building's gross square footage, but no specific reference to the Department of Finance. And there are slightly different criteria around some marginal spaces in buildings. Can one or more of you shed some light on the floor area calculations? Is each building going to need to do or recommended to do a floor area study, or rely or not rely on the Department of Finance square footage? And otherwise, I think this is a crucial topic for many covered buildings.
I'll take that one, Chris. So yes, it's not a Department of Finance square footage number, but owners actually should be used to that, because the definition that we've adopted in Local Law 97 is the exact definition that we've adopted for benchmarking for Local Law 84. It's exactly the methodology that owners should be using to report under Local Law 84, and they should have been using this since for many years, as Ross said. So this recognizes the full area of the building, and using a Department of Finance number, which subtracts a lot of area that is actually getting the benefit of those energy systems, it would penalize an owner by artificially lowering the actual square footage of the building. So that's the purpose of the clarification in this rule, is to identify that we've aligned 100% with how we tell you to report for local law 84. We anticipate, continuing at this time to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager data, and we're looking at that very carefully because we understand that owners, many of you use this across your entire portfolio in other cities, and it's great if we continue to use that resource. We'd like to not have to duplicate it. So for now, we're continuing to use the same guidance for benchmarking that we've used for several years.
Great, thanks, Gina. And maybe building on that question, there's also a couple questions about the energy use data side of things. So not the floor area, but some uncertainty around whether local law 84 energy data is to be the same as the data used under local law 97. Can you speak to that as well? I think it's pretty related to what you just covered.
So local law 84 and the benchmarking program utilize Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which has its own set of rules developed by the federal government. And those rules were meant to benchmark buildings and give us a methodology for comparing their energy consumption from one to another, so that owners are able to make informed decisions. However, Energy Star Portfolio Manager wasn't designed for a building performance standard like Local Law 97. So there are disconnects, and we're trying to identify those places where the portfolio manager system doesn't serve us well, it doesn't serve owners well when it comes to Local Law 97. And we'll be working with EPA to try and resolve some of those issues. An example is that Energy Star Portfolio Manager system tells owners now that if a property type is less than 10% of your building, that you shouldn't report it in Portfolio Manager, that you should roll that square footage up into a different property type. But in some cases, that actually penalizes and hurts owners. So that less than 10% property type might be a very energy intensive property type. It might be the use in their building that is responsible for a lot of their energy consumption. And then it artificially inflates their carbon intensity. So we're going to be doing that work with EPA. And as I've tried to explain, we really want to make that system continue to work for owners, both for benchmarking and for 97. And that's our goal. So we'll see how successful we can be in coordinating with EPA on those discrepancies. And Ross, maybe you have more to add.
You really covered it, I would say. I mean, continuing to partner with EPA to make the portfolio manager tool work for Local 97, and they are talking to other cities with building performance standards. So I believe that this is kind of front of mind for them as well.
Great, thank you both. We also have a question here on essentially on the service life of equipment and where that meets Local Law 97. So the question is, do any of the proposed rules and the GHG limits therein take into account the service life of existing building systems? And there are many mentioned in the question here, having replacement timelines that may be 15, 20 years off. And it may not be economical to replace those systems, may be wasteful is the concern here in the near term. How do the proposed rules meet a building with that type of scenario that's looking at relatively recently installed equipment?
I'll say that right now the rules don't address that, but it doesn't mean that we haven't been thinking about it. It is something that we're considering. We understand that it's sometimes doesn't make great sense operationally to decommission a piece of equipment that's still got a lot of life left in it, even if it's a fossil fuel burning piece of equipment, doesn't have the highest efficiency. We also need to consider those kinds of impacts. So it is something that we are taking into consideration as we're thinking about good faith effort and penalty structure. And we, hopefully we'll come up with a really smart way for owners to address that in that process.
Great, thanks, Gina. I'll add just one note that I think the basic structure of the law, not necessarily the proposed rules, but obviously they're building on that structure, is compliance periods over time, and the limits ratchet down slowly. So there's no prescriptive requirement to replace a single piece of equipment at any point in time for buildings that are subject to the emissions caps. So there's a basic flexibility to try and adapt to those types of scenarios, I think, baked into the law itself.
Chris, I just want to say also that
please.
while HVAC systems, in general, have a strong influence in terms of where the performance of a building lies, as you can see in a lot of the data, there are a lot of buildings with many of the systems that they were talking about with a variety of performance values. Operation of buildings is a critical component, even for legacy systems that have been around for a long time. It might be higher emitting. There are ways to improve those to ameliorate the concerns that that folks may have, and to extend maybe the useful life of that equipment to such a point where they can make an informed financial decision to replace that equipment, maybe not entirely, but in part to manage compliance and reduce emissions.
Great, thanks, Ian. We have a question here about clarifying the allowable double counting for clean DER. And we covered that fairly quickly. I'm wondering maybe if one of you could just recount how clean DER is handled and address this question around, is there double counting?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So there are two different ways that we recognize distributed energy resources. And the first is for all DER, you can apply a zero coefficient for the amount of electricity that you're offsetting from your use of utility electricity. And so if you have a on-site solar system and you're generating that solar power, you're eliminating some of your own electricity use, so it should just bring your electricity down. But if you're exporting that offsite and someone else is getting the benefit of that, then you can still take credit for that as well. That also allows you, under that coefficient, to take credit for things like a power purchase agreement or solar electricity that is a subscription through a utility but isn't a REC, because there were different rules in place before Tier 4 came into play. You also have the ability, if you've installed the system on site, to get extra credit for it. So you can get a deduction on top of that use of the coefficient. So that comes into play with things like energy storage. And the purpose is to encourage owners who have the physical space and the opportunity to make those investments, because we need to invest in renewables in New York City, because it's going to be more difficult to decarbonize our grid here locally. So for now, we've said, if depending on the configuration of the systems that you have installed on your site, you may be able to get double credit for them, depending on how the energy is used. And in some cases, someone else is taking credit for it, and you can't. So if you've exported and someone else is getting credit for it, you may not be able to. We're trying to cover a wide range of renewable, contracts and different types of installations. So there will be more information coming in future rulemaking on how those work, and we'll be covering that in our filing guide as well.
Excellent, thanks, Gina. There are a couple of questions touching on mixed occupancy or mixed use buildings, and are they evaluated proportionally depending on the different occupancies? There was one question specifically asking about multifamily with a grocery store on the ground floor. Ian, I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to how mixed use buildings are treated and how the update in the rules around property types might affect mixed use buildings, and others if you'd like to jump in as well.
Yeah, so as Gina pointed out, EPA sort of developed certain guidance and rules around the purpose for how they use property types. Under the law, essentially, buildings are multiple. Many of them are multiple occupancies, right? There's plenty of multifamily properties with ground floor supermarkets or retail. those property types should be broken out, particularly those high use ones, highly energy intensive ones, to allow for the limits that are appropriate for that building as a whole. There is the key is making sure that you represent the uses of the building accurately and consistently with sort of the definitions that are there. Again, I think earlier in the presentation, I clicked through a couple of slides to talk about retail. Like if you've got a Dwayne Reed or a Walgreens in there, that's one kind of retail. If you have a supermarket, it's a different kind of retail. Taking advantage of the property type system will allow a lot more granularity in terms of what's there versus potentially the building code process.
Great, thanks, Ian. We also have a couple questions here on the data or analysis behind the different space type emissions allowances. Ross, you touched on that to a degree. There's a specific question around whether there's a study or analysis used or that will be shared or otherwise. Is there anything you can share with the audience on those calculations and how they can learn more?
Yeah, there is. So the work that DOB and the mayor's office did over the past year or so to remap the 24 through 29 limits to the portfolio manager property type, that work's all been documented very thoroughly. We actually had, we generated a report and had the EPA team as well as the Department of Energy consider our methodology and, provide feedback. So we feel pretty good about the approach. And I think we aim to make that report available sometime pretty soon. So if people really want to get into the weeds, we'll make the weeds available. And, I can talk more about the method if there's a question, but generally, that detail of the approach will be available.
Great, thanks, Ross. I'm going to jump back to one of the questions we had submitted in advance around district steam, because we only heard about that very briefly, and I think it's important for a fairly large number of commercial properties in particular. The GHG coefficient for district steam or Con Edison steam is a notch lower in 2030 as opposed to 2024, but not a huge amount number. Can one of you explain a little bit how that number was set and what building owners can expect on that in future?
Yeah, I'll take that, Chris. We've worked very closely with representatives from Con Edison, including one of our advisory board members, to discuss how they anticipate the steam system changing over time. And they certainly are thinking about how to decarbonize the steam system and working on a plan. They've shared their anticipated work with us. However, for the coefficient that we've put into the rule for now, it's based on changes that they have both planned and funded for the steam system. So we're fairly confident that that 4% reduction is going to be achieved prior to 2030. That it's fairly certain. They have more planned, and those things are they're trying to get funding for them. They are working it out, and we will continue to communicate with them on what they're able to implement. And if necessary, we can adjust that number in the rule through the rulemaking process. So we believe in a future steam system in New York City that has significantly less carbon than it has now, but we don't know how they're going to get there and when. And so we will continue to work with them. That's similar to the natural gas system as well. We didn't have a concrete plan that was funded on how they're going to introduce lower carbon fuel into the natural gas system. And so if they're able to come to us at some point in the future and say, yes, we have brought the carbon content of that system down, here's the plan, here's when we're going to be able to achieve it, then we can adjust that coefficient as well.
Great, thanks, Gina. There's also one related question on the gap between the district steam coefficient in Local Law 97 and in the proposed rules, and in EPA portfolio manager more broadly. Is that something any of you can speak to, just to clarify quickly why there's a difference there?
Well, the coefficient in the portfolio manager system is a general default factor for district steam systems, and Con Edison is its own unique entity, and the data that we're basing on is information that we've received from Con Edison about our system here in New York. Great, thanks, Ross. There are a fair number of questions that are somewhat outside of the scope on the proposed rules themselves, asking around commercial tenants and the possibility of passing on costs or limits to tenants, around future coefficients, around the fine structure. I just want to flag for the audience that Laura spoke to many of those and more as things that DOB is still working on for potential future rulemaking. So unless others have a desire to weigh in on any of those, I'm going to move us, and I think we have time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. So unless Laura or others, you'd like to jump in on any of those?
No, I guess I just want to say for the penalties, our view is that buildings should be investing money in their buildings to make the emissions reductions and energy efficiency improvements. And so that is kind of what we're going with as our philosophy when we're doing the penalties. So there will be penalties, but we're interested in helping building owners and mitigate those penalties and work through compliance. And so just set that out there. When we do the rule, there'll be more details to go through, but I just want everyone aware of the kind of the philosophy we're working off of. We don't think penalties really benefit anybody. The work doesn't get done, and then building owners have less money to spend to get the work done, right? So just adding that little commentary.
Just Laura, just to amplify what Laura said, collecting penalties means that people aren't reducing emissions, right? And the goal ultimately is to reduce emissions. So finding solutions that move buildings in that direction, I think is key.
Great, thank you both. And we'd love to invite you back for a future webinar when we have future rules to propose to discuss. So we're nearing the end. We got a few minutes left. I'm gonna wrap us up with one question before I turn it back over to John. The proposed rules we're hearing about today are comprehensive, as John said off the top. They're also quite technical, as we've seen in the material you've covered. I'm sure there are many more questions. We have a long list in the Q&A here. Where can our audience get more information? Gina, you touched on some communication and outreach. Can you elaborate a little more on the communication efforts, the outreach, the resources that are available, assistance that is available as we're moving towards implementation?
Sure, Chris, thank you. We definitely are putting more information on our websites. There's a Department of Buildings webpage dedicated to sustainability. You can go there, and then that provides links to a dedicated Department of Buildings sustainability website that has a tremendous amount more very detailed information on it about Local Law 97 specifically. Our plan is to expand that in many ways. We're working on a map, so you can click on your building and find out all of this information about that building. We're adding information, as Laura pointed out, on affordable housing, and we'll continue to update information that will make its way into our rulemaking process on that website as well. In addition to that, we are bringing on board more staff at Department of Buildings to help us with outreach, communications, education, training, and direct assistance to owners. We do want to just reiterate the first place an owner should go. Come to Department of Buildings with whatever questions you have, but please go to the accelerator and get their help. They are there to help an owner create a plan, to help them find financing, to help them find service providers. And they have a ton of information about buildings in the local N97 system. They should already be able to tell you some things about your building when you call them. They give you a dedicated manager to help you through the process, and they will go all the way through the process with you to the point that you get a permit and the work begins. So that's a huge investment by the city, and we really want owners to take advantage of that. So there will be more invested in our outreach and communication. We encourage everybody to go to our Sustainable Buildings website. We have an email address that was on that last slide for the buildings emissions team. So you can send us emails. Many of you have been emailing with us over the last 2 years, especially asking questions about information that was coming in the rules. So we're so excited that we're finally able to share that information. And we'll continue to do more to provide information to stakeholders and building owners. Laura, anything that you want to add there?
We are going to do our best to answer your questions. I know a lot of people submitted questions we didn't get to, but we are going to figure out a way to get back to you. There's a recording of these questions, or we'll get the list of them. We do have our website to ask questions, as Gina said, but we will figure out a way to get back to you so all the questions are answered. And I saw in the comments maybe a way where we can publish some answers. So if everyone has the same question, right, that we've answered it once, and then you could use it for information going forward.
Yep, we have FAQs on our website. We'll continue to add to those as we move closer to the compliance deadline.
Great, thank you all so much. I want to thank our audience for submitting questions in advance. And today, I want to thank Gina, Ross, Ian, and Laura for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to John to close us out.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thanks again to our friends from the Department of Buildings and the Mayor's Office, Laura, Gina, Ian, Ross. What a terrific program. Thank you for providing the information everybody's looking for. More than 800 people joined this event today, and we appreciate your participation. If you like what you see today and you're not a member of Urban Green, please join us. Our mission is to decarbonize buildings for a healthy and resilient communities. And we need all the support we can to advance that big, bold mission. We advance our mission in 4 ways. We convene experts to solve big problems. We do research to fill knowledge gaps. We do public policy and advocacy, the type of like you've seen today. And we provide education to help us get to that carbon neutral future that we all want. So check us out on our website, and please join us and help us to advance our mission. I want to talk about some great upcoming events while you're all with us. On November 10th, we have our Urban Green Live, which is our video podcast series with Joe Allen on what's next for healthy buildings. Joe's with the Harvard School of Public Health and one of the world's premier experts on indoor air quality. So please join us for that. Our holiday member reception is on December 6th. It's always a great time in person. Please join us for that. And actually, that's where we kick off the election for our board of directors for next year. So it's important for you to participate. And then on December 13th is an opportunity to continue this conversation with Laura Popa, the Deputy Commissioner of Sustainability at the Department of Buildings, to talk about the new Bureau of Sustainability and all the great work that they're doing on Local Law 97 and beyond. And so that's a great opportunity to continue the conversation we've started today. So we hope to see you at some of these events. And in the meantime, please stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for joining.